Welcome to the third in our series of interviews with Dr. Jarold K. Zeman, former professor of church history at Acadia Divinity College. Dr. Zeman, during your time at the Divinity College, you were not only professor, but you filled a number of other roles. I wonder if you would explore just a couple of those for us in terms of the development of the college and the things that you did in relationship to it.
Well, let me begin with saying that my 23 years at ADC were extremely happy and fulfilling. The beginnings were not easy, but that was part of the general adjustment, also change to different culture in Canada. But on the whole, I felt always I had the full support and love of my colleagues and most students. So I praised God for the experience at ADC. In addition to the classroom activities and all that goes on behind the scenes, correcting papers and interviewing students, I think probably in terms of energy and time, the second thing I applied most energy and time was promoting the Divinity College. Promoting in the sense of visiting churches and associations, not only in the Maritimes or Atlantic Canada, but beyond that, because wherever I went, I tried to be an ambassador for ADC. And often when I went to Toronto for other meetings, I would meet a student who had inquired about coming to Acadia and try to help them understand what's going on and persuade them, actually, in a gentle way. So I have, in fact, I would estimate that at one time I would be away about 1/3 of the nights in the year on these trips to the more distant parts of the convention, northern New Brunswick or elsewhere. On the inside, every professor is expected, besides teaching, to assume some administrative roles. And mine was primarily the continuing education for pastors and some lay people. I could mention that I was dean of the chapel, I think 4 years, and enjoyed it too. But I think the continuing education I enjoyed to the limit, chiefly because it brought us into contact with the life of the church. I mean, the pastors, after all, is where the action is. It's not in the seminary. And so to have pastors coming back, both our graduates and those who have studied elsewhere, at least twice a year for the Hayward Lectures Week and the Simpson Week, I always looked forward to it, and it was Abner Langley, I think, who had the main plans, and I was carrying out his suggestions. The Hayward Week was already, the Hayward Lectures had started before I came here, but we expanded it into 4 days of continuing education in daytime. And then because the Hayward Lectures tended to be in the theoretical field, so there was a desire for something more practical, closer to the ministry. So that's where Simpson Lectures came into being, and the Simpson Week as a supplement to it. And they became gradually more popular than the Hayward Week, as you know. And I did most of the administrative work for these two events for about 15 years. Correspondence and accommodations. In the early days, most ministers didn't have money, at least so they said, so we had to find billets in homes. And so I was foolish enough, instead of leaving it to the secretaries, although in those days there was only a couple of secretaries in the offices for the whole school, so I would even spend time phoning people to see if they could put up a minister overnight and give him breakfast next morning. But I enjoyed all of that. It was sort of like being back in the pastorate. I think the bipolarity of the continuing education that we have developed, the more theoretical one in Hayward Week and the more practical one in Simpson Week, was very wholesome. And I wish that ministers would see it and would come to both. But most ministers can only afford not only for money's sake, but time-wise, to be away from the churches once a year, so they usually choose Simpson Week. We have tried other things which relate to continuing education, which should be mentioned here, and that's field seminars. That has disappeared as the enrollment of the school grew, but I think that was primarily my initiation, that we felt that the students, especially some, needed direct exposure to the different types of contexts in which they might work. So, for instance, the first field seminar was in Sydney, Industrial Society, and all of our students and faculty, we traveled to Cape Breton, and while in Sydney for about 3 days, we met labor union leaders, the representatives of the management, and had a tour of the industry, of the steel mills. Extremely important to my mind, except that traveling back we hit a snowstorm and we barely lost the lives of students in one of the cars. And then we had comparable field seminars. It was every other year. I remember one in Moncton and one in Truro and one somewhere on the South Shore. So that continued until the school became too large, the student body, to be able to accommodate and make arrangements. But I think that idea may be today, with the large enrollment, that one could take part of the school, let's say the juniors or the seniors, and have that kind of exposure, but there are other avenues for it now.
There was an article in Open Doors, the book which you wrote, in which you talk about a plea for a balance in theological education. Do you want to talk about that just a bit?
I addressed that in my last 2 messages while I was still teaching full-time in the chapel. I find it a bit disturbing, and I don't think that's because of my prejudice as a church historian, because I have played these other roles and my heart is really in the ministry of the church. But I find it disturbing that back in 1968 we had 4 professors in the theoretical fields, Old Testament, New Testament, systematics and church history, and there were only 2 in the practical, which wasn't right. Now I think if my count was correct back in when I retired, 91, it might have changed even since then. There were 4, still the same 4 in the theoretical, and there were 8 in the practical, plus a large number of adjunct professors, especially in the clinical pastoral education and Christian education. I think there is a general trend in the seminaries through the 80s and now 90s to train practitioners and not theologians. And yet the minister is the only person, certainly in a village setting and even in most of the towns and small cities, he is the only person that has the knowledge of biblical languages of the original text, Hebrew and Greek, or at least Greek. He has the equipment for theological discernment. He is acquainted with the development of the church through the centuries. And yet he is not, most of the ministers, whether it be he or she, are not using that and to the full potential. Instead, they're being pushed more and more by their churches, but also by their education, to be practitioners of many other specialized skills for which there are other resource people in the community. Let's take counseling. Well, the minister might have had a course in clinical pastoral education and maybe 1 or 2 electives, but next to him somewhere in the community is a trained psychiatrist and psychologist who has far deeper understanding of human soul and needs, and I think that ministers should not pretend that they are experts in all these practical skills, when in fact they are but beginners in those fields, and there are better trained persons with specialties related to the medical field. That may be my prejudice, but I don't hesitate to speak my mind, and I would hope that the school in the future, as it makes new appointments to faculty, would try to keep a better balance between those two branches. I would also like to see more integration into disciplinary courses, which at one time we tried and I think found quite satisfactory, but it has been abandoned under the pressure of other duties laid on faculty. Is that what you were asking about?
That's what I wanted to hear. I wonder if we could go on just to talk a little bit about your students, some of whom, after they left the Divinity College, went on, particularly some to higher academic degrees, that kind of thing. Any observations you want to make?
I don't know how much of that was going on in the earlier history of theological education at Acadia, that is before 1968, how many graduates would have gone for doctoral studies. But I think it says something about the quality of our MDiv education if we have had, I haven't counted the total, but I imagine somewhere between 12 and 15 of our graduates by now have gone on to doctoral studies, the majority in biblical fields, but some in church history, in ethics and apologetics, in systematic theology like in Boston, some went to Scotland, and others to Toronto School of Theology. I think that's extremely satisfying to the faculty when you see your former students going on, and of course most of them hoping to teach, which may be a vain hope with the oversupply of doctoral candidates these days. But even if they return to pastorates, I think it will be for the benefit of churches and their own if they had the postgraduate studies. And most of them have been very close friends of mine.
In the midst of your years here, you had your denominational life in Ontario and Quebec before you came, and we talked about that in an earlier segment. But what about your involvement in denominations and the post-denominational kind of things that you have done since you've come?
I will, I think, focus my remarks entirely on the Baptist Federation of Canada, because that's the organization to which I have given most of my energy when I was at ADC. The Baptist Federation of Canada was born to a large extent through the initiative of Dr. Watson Kirkconnell, the well-known president of Acadia, who at that time, of course, was still teaching at McMaster. And I'm sure from my conversations, private conversations with Dr. Kirkconnell after we came to Wolfville, that it was his hope and the hope of several others who were at the cradle of the Federation back in 1944, that sort of additional structure for Baptists of Canada, which would bring together a national fellowship, would eventually lead into the formation of definite administrative structures on a national level comparable to what the United Church has, Presbyterian Church, Anglican Church, but even some of the evangelical denominations like the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada and Christian Missionary Alliance and others. We are the only larger Protestant denomination in Canada which doesn't have operative and functional national organization. The Federation, as I've often said, was like a spare wheel in the trunk of the car. The Baptist work was driven by chauffeurs from the three conventions, and somewhere in the back seat was hiding the secretary of the French Union with their 15 churches, and the Federation was the spare wheel in the trunk. When there was need for some particular project like the Sharing Way to help people in need overseas, so the Federation was called upon and succeeded. But our hope was, I've been involved with the Federation certainly for about 20 years, and especially as vice president from 76 to 79, then president 79 to 82, past president in 82, 85. So during that decade, from 76 to 85, I was at the heart of the Federation work and all the frustrations, the dreams that we had, the hopes, for instance, that the Christian education boards of the three conventions could cooperate on a national level so that perhaps there would be one secretary for Christian education with regional offices related to him. Same in evangelism and social service. But it never came to be. I think regionalism, as we know, is very strong in Canada politically and otherwise ethnically. Most people in the West think that's it, and Maritimers have their own identity and are suspicious of Ontario. So I can understand the reasons. But why is it that the Baptists could not move towards a national organization when some other Baptist group have? For instance, the Fellowship of Evangelical Baptist Churches, which has a very modest national organization and office, but nevertheless it has it, embracing all of Canada. And the Southern Baptists, the latest newcomer in Baptist work to Canada, they also call themselves Canadian Southern Baptist, not Western Canadian Baptist or Central. So that has been, I think, the biggest disappointment in my involvement with the Federation. I think the Federation provided inspiration. In the early years, I have attended all assemblies except when I was out of the country. I remember traveling to the assembly in Vancouver back in 1953 when we had a pool, travel pool. So it was relatively cheap when all people, all delegates pooled their resources and we could travel by train, clergy at half price from Toronto to Vancouver and back for peanuts. And it has been, there have been times, assemblies of great inspiration. But now, and these are not sour grapes, because I'm off the scene since I retired, but I think it was a mistaken step to merge the Federation with what was Canadian Baptist Overseas Mission Board, CBOM, and to make one new organization, Canadian Baptist Ministries. Canadian Baptists have their main identity through the local churches. In Baptist ecclesiology, the church is expressed in the local church, and in the universal church, we do not say that the convention is a church or the federation is a church. But these regional and national organizations have certain ecclesiological and ecclesiastic dimensions which we have now lost. I mean, nobody will persuade me, and I think anybody looking at Baptists from outside can believe that an organization called Canadian Baptist Ministries, which looks like a missionary organization, and that's what it is a national ecclesiastical body that represents Baptists in Ottawa on political issues and so on. So I understand the financial reasons why the Federation collapsed, because it was at the mercy of grants from the three conventions and everybody is in financial difficulties. But I think it was a mistaken step to merge the Federation and to make it not only a spare wheel, but like that little spare wheel that we have in the Chrysler cars. You know what it looks like.
During your time of involvement with Baptist Federation of Canada, you mentioned several of the offices. Why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the action that was taking place? I know there were a number of issues that came up before you began to hold some of the we might say, more significant offices. There was the withdrawal from the Canadian Council of Churches. Do you want to talk a little bit about how that happened?
The withdrawal of membership of the Baptist Federation from the Canadian Council of Churches was really not a decision of the Baptist Federation, but it was a necessary and logical follow-up to the decisions of two of its constituent conventions, namely the Maritime and the French Union, which voted decidedly to terminate their membership in the Canadian Council of Churches. the Baptist Federation, being an umbrella organization of the 4 conventions unions, could no longer represent Canadian Baptists at the National Council of Churches, Canadian Council of Churches, if half of its constituency has voted against it. So the Federation Council simply implemented what, in fact, has been decided in the eastern half of Canada, so to say, by the 2 conventions unions. When that happened, the BCOQ, Baptists in Ontario and Quebec, voted to join the Canadian Council of Churches on their own, and so they continue to be members. And the Baptist Union of Western Canada voted to become member of the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. So here we have this anomalous situation, but typical of Baptist pluralism, where Western Union is affiliated with Fellowship, Evangelical Fellowship, Ontario with Canadian Council, and French Canada and Maritime Atlantic Canada with nobody. We're the isolationists. I regret it. I think many of us in leadership positions pleaded for affiliation, for membership with both. And there are, for instance, the Mennonites, and there are 2 other denominations that are both members of the Evangelical Fellowship and the Canadian Council. But it was not to be. When I served in Ontario, Quebec, in the Home Mission Office, I had fairly regular involvement in the Canadian Council of Churches, which at that time was a different cup of tea from what it is now. It was primarily an opportunity for consultation of denominational secretaries in the different fields of church endeavors. So, for instance, the Home Mission secretaries would meet regularly to discuss port chaplaincies to welcome immigrants, social action, some petitions to the government in Ottawa, evangelism, and other issues like that. It was not a body to discuss theology. It was a practical organization to facilitate contact and cooperation, to avoid overlappings, to facilitate joint projects at that time between the 4 major Protestant groups, the churches, Anglican, United Presbyterian, and Baptist. Since then, of course, the Canadian Council has undergone radical transformation. The Roman Catholic Church is now a member of it, and it seems to be preoccupied with political issues, both national and international. It's a pressure group, and as such, it serves a definite purpose. There's no question there is need for such a voice, but it's a different council of churches from what it was in the 60s and before that.
Can I follow up a little bit in the context of your own personal development? Because earlier in one of the interviews you talked about becoming a Baptist and the Baptist distinctives, and now we've talked a little bit about the interchurch relationships and working with other denominations which were part of your lives. How do you see those 2 things coming together because of some of the Baptist distinctives as over against working together with other denominations and remaining or continuing a Baptist identity?
Well, I guess I can begin with a question. How could I be an isolationist? It would be an absolute contradiction of my life story, my pilgrimage. Having been exposed to such varied spiritual, theological, cultural, ethnic, and other political influences, I mean, it's impossible for me to shut the door. That's why I call that book of my selected articles Open Doors. I always wanted to have doors open in all directions. If I am clear about my convictions, in this case Baptist convictions, to say nothing of Christian evangelical convictions, then I'm not afraid to dialogue with anybody. And I have dialogued with Protestants of practically every shade, and with Roman Catholics and people of other religions, with ease and difficulty, and always welcomed it as an opportunity to give witness. And I cannot understand this fear of contamination, that if if you are on a committee with somebody with whom you disagree on the nature of the church and sacraments and ministry, if you sit with him or her and discuss certain common issues, that you'll get contaminated, your theology will get corrupt. If you're clear in your theological convictions, if you're clear in your commitment to Christ, how could you be influenced to the point of wavering and betraying those commitments and that clarity? So I have never had a problem of reaching out with both arms, I would say. On the one hand, to the evangelical camp, and I should mention here, I think, a very important sort of interlude in which I had lots to do, and that was the attempt to bring together in Canada the so-called believers' churches. A believers' church, by definition, is a church made up only of committed and professing believers, implying that there are churches, and we have some in the Baptist fold, where you have a mixed crowd. You have real committed Christians and you have a lot of dead wood. People whose names are on the roll and they never darken the doors of the church. Some of them you couldn't find if you search for their addresses. I mean, that's a complete denial of the Baptist concept of regenerate church membership and the New Testament concept of the body of Christ, which is like a tree with branches. A branch will wither and die if it's cut off from the trunk. So, there are other denominations that share with us these basic convictions about believers' baptism, regenerate church membership, priesthood of all believers. And so some of us, ministers and professors and lay people across Canada, felt that we should be involved in a movement which started in the United States to bring together spokesmen for these different traditions and have the opportunity to discuss their common concerns and bear witness. I went together with people like Dr. Howard Bentall and others to the first such conference in Louisville, Kentucky at the Southern Baptist Seminary campus back in 1967, where people like Latourette, the great historian, and George Williams from Harvard and others gave papers. The papers have been published. And there has been a series of these meetings, usually with a narrower topic, ever since. Well, back to Canada, we try to bring together representatives of the different varieties of Baptists. We have about 7 groups of Baptists in Canada, as you know. Mennonites, they have more than 7. And Christian Missionary Alliance, any denomination that believes in regenerate church membership. And we didn't succeed too well with anybody except the Mennonites. And so in Winnipeg, back in 1978, we held a terrific conference, I thought. We had representative Baptist pastors from the Maritimes all the way to the Pacific, and likewise for the Mennonites. And for a week, we hammered out many issues that were confronting us in the late 70s, and then published it in this book, The Believer's Church in Canada, which is now out of print, but for which a study guide has been made available, and I used to teach a course on Believer's Church, as you know. It is an attempt to enlarge the understanding of cooperation among Christians, that it's not just either or, it's not either Canadian Council of Churches or World Council of Churches or the Evangelical Fellowship and the World Evangelical Fellowship. That there would be a third way, the Believer's Church movement. Well, we didn't have any organization, didn't have any office, didn't have any money. And so, in retrospect, I can say as a historian, the Believer's Church thrust in Canada, which I think was precious to some people, provided a little bridge, a link from the one-sided or lopsided ecumenicity which Canadian Baptists used to practice, being linked only to the Canadian Council, to where they are now, that they're reaching in both directions. And so hopefully that has fulfilled some useful purpose.
Dr. Zeman, thank you again for this time that we've been able to spend together. Time goes so quickly. We've come to the end of segment 3, and we look forward to the beginning then of our last segment, segment 4. Thank you very much.